Hello and welcome to Two Car Pros. Today we're going to show you how to replace a power steering pump in a Ford Explorer between the years of 2002 and 2005. Grab a cup of coffee or something nice to drink and let's settle in. It's going to be a long one. Before we get started, it's a good idea to unplug the negative terminal on the battery using an 8mm crescent wrench. A socket will work as well. Make sure you're extra careful to never ever touch a tool across the negative and positive battery terminals. This could cause serious bodily harm. Next, we need to check if the engine's cooling system is cool enough to work on, so squeeze the upper radiator hose, and if it gives way, this means the engine is not under pressure, and you can open the petcock at the bottom of the radiator on the passenger side, and we're going to let all the coolant spill out. And we can also remove the radiator or reservoir cap. Next, we can remove these two plastic engine bezels. This one just kind of pulls off using a clip system. However, this one that's located on top of the engine requires 4 bolts. Ours only has 3, but there are 4 there. If yours has all the bolts intact, ours just doesn't. It's a 1/4-inch drive. There's no socket required, and a little extension helps as well. With the radiator fluid removed, we can remove the upper radiator hose. Your upper radiator hose might be stuck to your thermostat housing, so it's a good idea to get a mechanic's pick or even a flat, decent-sized standard screwdriver to kind of separate the bind between the hose and the housing. And we need to remove the radiator's overflow tube, and then we can continue removing the upper radiator hose. Next, we need to work on removing this radiator shroud, so this is going to involve removing these AC lines out of these tricky little clips. If you fuss around with them enough and kind of bend them one way or another, eventually they'll give way and you can remove the line. Now we're going to take an 8mm socket and remove the 2 bolts that hold the radiator shroud in place. Now we can remove said radiator shroud. Now, if you don't have the proper tools to hold the water pump pulley, you can also use a large pipe wrench like we have here. You can rent that tool I just showed you at O'Reilly's or any auto parts store for pretty inexpensive or usually free. I highly recommend doing that, but if you don't, you can use a large pipe wrench to kind of hold that pulley while you're removing the radiator fan. Now we can use a big adjustable wrench. I do not know how big the size is. I just used an adjustable wrench. And we're going to put it on the radiator fan nut, and we're going to grab a hammer and hit it loose. Luckily with this car, it's a normal thread, but on any other car it could be different. Just pay attention to the fan blade pitch. See, our fan has to rotate that way. If you're looking at it from the front of the vehicle, it needs to turn anti-clockwise. To spin, so you use the exact same motion to walk it off the threads. Pretty easy. But pay attention, if your fan pitches the opposite direction, you are going to hammer it to the right, so it's a reverse thread. But we got lucky, it's a normal thread. But there might be a silent revision, so do please pay attention to that. And next we can remove the serpentine belt. You're just going to grab a 3/4 inch drive ratchet and remove the tension off the tensioner by pushing downward. Make sure when you're removing the serpentine belt, it's always a good idea, if you don't have a diagram, to take a photo of how it's routed. There's plenty of resources online to find that information, and I also believe on this particular car, they put the belt diagram underneath the hood. But again, it's always a good idea to take pictures with your smartphone or something, just so you have a photo record of what the belt looked like, because this one's kind of tricky. Next, we need to remove this power steering hose. This is going to leak hydraulic fluid everywhere, so make sure you have a drain pan underneath it. Now we can remove the bottom radiator shroud. There are two 8mm bolts, one on the left side of the bottom of the radiator and one on the right. You're going to have to fish the bottom radiator shroud up through the top of the vehicle. Next, we need to remove the plastic cover piece that covers up the lug nuts, and then we need to break the lugs loose with a breaker bar. With the lugs broken loose, we can jack the vehicle up into the air and place a jack stand. This is a good place to mount your jack in case you were wondering, and we can slide a jack stand right before the jack just there. We only really need one for this job. You can put two if you want to be extra safe, but one is really enough as long as you have a nice sturdy 12-ton jack stand. And if you're really nervous about it, a good idea is to take the wheel and store it underneath the vehicle, because if the vehicle were to fall, it wouldn't be able to fall any further than how thick the wheel is. Okay, with that done, we need to remove this flap that covers up our power steering pump. I broke every single clip when I was removing this flap, so it's probably a good idea to run to the auto parts store and get a set of body clips. They are extremely inexpensive, and yes, you will probably break them. They are made of very, very cheap plastic, and being that this was a 2002 Ford Explorer, it was quite old, so that plastic was very brittle and just snapped right off. Next, we're going to need a power steering pump pulley remover. It looks like this. It operates in this way where it hooks itself onto the pulley and pushes itself off of the power steering pump spindle. These are available at every single auto parts store, and usually you can rent them for free. I happen to have this one in the shop ready to go, but you'll see later in this video I actually had to go to O'Reilly's and rent one for free, because the one I have wasn't the correct size to put the pulley back on. But we're just going to remove the pulley right now. So you need to install the removal tool like I just showed you, and you're going to basically hook it up and screw it in, and you're going to have two wrenches. These wrenches can differ on size depending on your tool, and you're going to twist them so the threads thread inward. This will push the pulley off of, or to pull the pulley off of the spindle. So you're going to hold the wrench closest to the engine steady and operate either a ratchet or another wrench. I think I'm using a torque wrench here because it's a bit longer and you get more leverage. And I'm basically screwing that really big screw all the way inward, and this pulls the pulley off of the spindle. This is going to take a pretty big amount of work. It is pretty frustrating. You can see there I have the wrench actually nestled up against the frame, it looks like. So the frame's actually holding the wrench for me as I'm ratcheting it off. It took about 20 minutes of pure ratcheting, so if you don't think you're making any progress, I promise you most likely are. It's just on there very, very tight, and you're going to have to do some work to get it off. Next, we're going to inspect our pulley to make sure it is in good shape and does not have any damage. Ours looks like it's in good shape, so we're going to move on. This line bolt is going to be the bane of your existence for a little while. As you can see, I'm not removing it in this shot. This is because it's very tight working space here, so I wanted to show you its location. It is an 18 millimeter. You are going to need a line wrench at least to break it loose. So a line wrench there is an almost complete wrench. This enables you to not round a line bolt. So you want to use the line wrench side of the line wrench. It's that almost complete side on the 18 millimeter line bolt. And then you can use the open end side because it's a little more convenient, but only when it's broken loose. You would not want to round that line bolt. Now we can remove our power steering fluid reservoir. Now we can remove the bolts that hold the power steering pump to the engine. There's a total of 3, but first there is 2 nuts on a set of bigger bolts, so we're going to need a deep well socket to remove them. Now we can remove that ground and that bracket out of the way. Do not forget that ground when you are reinstalling the power steering pump. Now we can remove the 3 bolts that physically hold the power steering pump to the engine. There's 2 on top of the power steering pump unit, and there's a tricky one that is underneath it. It's tough to get a shot on for the camera, just because operating a camera in that confined of a space is difficult to do. But if you feel around down there, you will find it. There are just 3 bolts. There is another, it's sort of like a pseudo bolt, but it's just like a little aluminum cylinder that holds the power steering pump to the bracket. So we're just going to remove the bracket totally. That way we don't have to deal with that little shim. You'll see it in a little bit. And here comes the elusive 3rd bolt. Okay, and the final nut that holds the bracket to the engine is a 13mm. I'm using a ratcheting wrench here, but you could also use a deep well socket. And we need to remove this, and then we can finagle the bracket out of the engine compartment. So now it's going to take a little bit of maneuvering to get the bracket out there, but if you remove the amount of bolts and the correct nut there and the power steering reservoir correctly, you'll see that it can come out quite easily. This part's a little tricky. We're going to need to get the bracket off of the old power steering pump so we can affix it to our new one. I'm just going to use a standard screwdriver here to pry the bracket off. You can see that, it has like a pseudo fourth bolt in there. I'll remove it for you in just a second. That was kind of giving us problems earlier. That's why we had to remove the entire bracket. I have a pair of vice grips there, and I'm removing it now. Once I've removed that, I don't even know what to call it. It's just like a little shaft. It's like a little tiny aluminum tube. I'm going to call it a pseudo bolt. I'm sure it has a proper name that people will scream at me in the comments about. And then we need to remove the power steering reservoir tube, the return line off of the old power steering pump. Now we can take a look at our new power steering pump and ensure that it's identical to our old one. Now this repair was performed on a 2002 Ford Explorer. I know in 2003 they changed the power steering pump design a little bit, but it's mostly the same. So if you have like a 2004 or a 2005 Ford Explorer and you're kind of scratching your head because it looks a little different, that'd be why. But the repair should be pretty much the same. The units will look just a teeny bit different from what you see in the video, but they should match your original unit. Now we can get the power steering pump, the new one, ready for installation by removing this black cap and the blue plug. Once we've done that, we need to transfer all of the old hardware from the old pump onto the new unit itself. Your power steering pump also probably came with one of these. It's an installer. I'll show it later in the video. I would just recommend throwing that away immediately. However, be careful of your packaging because they are going to give you a nylon O-ring or a nylon seal. You're going to absolutely need that, so keep an eye out for it. There is some oil inside of the power steering unit, so make sure you're not wearing any nice clothes when you're operating it. It will spill out the second you turn it over. Now we can affix our old brackets to our new unit. The same exact way that we pulled it off. It's a good idea to take a picture of your old one to see how it goes back together, or you could just watch this video again and again. I would really appreciate that. I'm pretty sure that that tube that we removed earlier, the one I don't really have a name for, the pseudo bolt I'm referring it to, I'm pretty sure that's a manufacturing process. I'm just going to replace it. You should definitely replace it as well. It holds everything together while you're working on it, so in hindsight, it is kind of nice to have, even though it does make removal of the pump a little trickier than it should have been. With that back in place, we can grab our power steering fluid reservoir and reattach the feed line. And now it's ready to go back into our vehicle. Again, we are going to carefully maneuver our power steering pump assembly back into place. You can use the bolt that's hanging off the engine as sort of a guide. I hung it on to the engine block bolt, the one we removed very last, that little nut. I hung it on that and sort of used that as a guide, and then you're just going to fish it back onto the engine block like I've done here. It might take you a little time, so just be patient. It will come. And now we can replace the bolts that hold the power steering pump to the engine block. Don't forget to replace the elusive third bolt that is located underneath the power steering pump. I was able to get a little bit better angle for the replacement. Now we can replace that ground and bracket that we removed earlier. Now we can replace the bolts that hold the power steering fluid reservoir in place. And don't forget to replace the nut that holds the power steering bracket to the engine. Okay, so here's another tough part. Here is the nylon seal that you absolutely need. Do not install the line nut back onto the power steering pump without it. And then we are going to grab our 18mm line wrench and reinstall the line bolt back into the power steering pump unit. Making sure that you thread it by hand first. Do not cross thread them. And then you can use the open end side to sort of speed things up. But as soon as you feel it grabbing or getting tight, switch to the line wrench end to make sure it's nice and snug. While we're down here, we also need to replace the return line that we removed earlier off of the fluid radiator. I'm sorry I don't have any footage of that, but you do need to replace that or else power steering fluid will go everywhere when you try to fill the system. Okay, here comes another tricky part. We need to reinstall the pulley on the power steering pump. So we're going to put the pulley back on the spindle and go from there. Now this is the tool that AC Delco provided me with my power steering pump. It is an absolute joke. I can't even believe they gave this with us. It comes with an okay bolt, but the nut is a square. In what universe is that okay? I don't know. I rounded it. It's junk. Throw it away. run down to O'Reilly's or AutoZone and rent this. It was absolutely free to rent, and it made this job a breeze. This is a power steering pump pulley removal and installer. So we're going to take the thinner bolt here and put it into the installer and then thread it right onto the power steering pump spindle. So here I am threading it into the spindle itself. It actually screws into the power steering pump, and then that block there that has a nut, casted into it or welded into it, I'm not really sure. You're basically going to screw that block, and it's going to push the power steering pulley back onto the spindle. When they make these at factories, they have enormous machines that sort of just push them on real fast. Obviously, we can't recreate that in a shop, so you have to use this installer tool. It is going to take some time. You're going to need a wrench and a ratchet. Preferably, you're going to want wrenches that are a bit longer so you can get a bit more leverage. You're just going to keep screwing the block onto the pulley itself. So you're going to hold the back wrench like I am with my right hand, and you're going to screw it on with your left hand. I used a ratcheting wrench. I know not a lot of people have that luxury, but it does make it a lot nicer. And it took me quite some time. I think it took me at least 20 minutes to put the pulley back on. It's on correctly when the spindle and the pulley are flush with each other. You see that? You see how those two surfaces are at the exact same height. If they weren't, you'd have a problem. Next, we need to reinstall our serpentine belt that we removed earlier. You could install your serpentine belt after you install your radiator fan, but it's much easier to do it this way. Here's a great diagram that'll show you how I'm trying to route this belt. I'm sorry if it's not too detailed for you, but I think it explains things a little bit better than the video does. And once I have the serpentine belt on correctly, I found it really easy to route the serpentine belt except for the alternator, and then put tension on the spring tensioner, and then just kind of loop it back on top of the alternator last. I found that to be the easiest way to do things, and once it's on, you're going to go ahead and manually use your hand and feel around and make sure that the belt is on all the pulleys correctly, because if it's not on the pulleys, it can walk off, and then you have another problem that the serpentine belt's not on when you start the engine, and that could cause some problems. Next, we're going to replace our radiator fan. So we're just going to walk it back on. Luckily with this fan, to walk it on, it's just righty-tighty as normal. But again, pay attention to your fan blade's pitch. If they look like this, then you can copy us. But if they're the opposite, do the opposite of what we're doing. And when you're tightening the fan back on, make sure the fan nut is spinning, because the clutch can be disengaged and the fan nut won't be spinning. See, that actually happened to us here, where the nut is not spinning and the fan is. You won't accomplish anything and the fan will just fall off. So it's a good idea to get an adjustable wrench and just walk it on manually. Okay, so once it's walked on all the way back, you can get it by hand or with a wrench, we're going to grab the adjustable wrench again and a hammer, and we're going to hammer it back onto the threads. You want to make sure this is on nice and snug. You really don't want your fan walking back off your threads right into your radiator. So you're going to want to hit the hammer on that wrench pretty hard. Next, we can replace our upper radiator shroud that we removed earlier with those 8mm bolts. Then we need to replace the AC lines that we had to remove earlier by clipping them back into their homes. Now we can replace our overfill line that we removed earlier and our upper radiator hose. This is our overflow hose that we removed earlier, and we're just putting it back. No big deal. Now we need to replace the coolant. I'm using a fancy pants funnel, but any funnel will do, or you can just have a really steady hand. That works as well. Just looks good on camera and is easy for me to operate as well as operating a camera. I'm going to use Walmart Super Tech here because it's good for all makes and models, and it was pretty inexpensive. It's about $7 a gallon, and it works just fine. So what we're going to do is fill our reservoir until it reaches the cold fill line that's between these two lines. You will see right here, and you want to get it right between that level. Now we can reconnect our battery that we removed earlier. Again, I believe that's an 8mm bolt you're going to screw back on with a wrench or a socket, and we're going to start the car for a little bit. Once the engine's been running for a little bit, you're going to notice a drop in coolant, so you're going to need to add coolant until it is right between those 2 points once again, and then you're going to let it run for quite a while. As long as the engine is running, the thermostat is going to open, and this is going to let the coolant explore all kinds of air pockets inside of the engine. So let the engine run and just keep an eye on it. As it goes down, just add some more until it becomes good between those 2 points that you just saw. Once your engine's nice and hot and you're pretty sure that it's not going to, the thermostat's not going to open anymore, usually this happens about 10 minutes or so, we can go ahead and remove our funnel and replace our reservoir cap. It's also a good idea to keep an eye on it over the next couple days and see if the level has dropped any. Of course, waiting for the car to become cool before you open the cooling system. Now we can replace the 2 plastic engine bezels we removed earlier. Again, the top one is just a simple 4 bolts that use a 1/4-inch drive to screw in. And this one just sort of snaps back in place. There's no nuts or bolts involved. Next, we need to reconnect the battery, and now we can fill our power steering system. Next, we need to replace the power steering fluid that we removed earlier, and you could use the old power steering fluid that you took out if it's in a clean enough container, but I'm just going to use some new stuff. We're going to fill it up to the fill line. Using a flashlight will make it easier to see where the fill line is exactly. Now we're going to start the engine, but only for like a second, maybe 2 seconds, because what you don't want to have happen is the pump aerate. So you want the pump to never ever have air in it when it's operating. So when you turn on the pump, it's going to flush everything through the system, and you're going to need to be quick to turn the engine back off. So once it's drained through that, go ahead and add some more so you're up to the fill line once again, and start the engine, and then turn it back off, check it, start the engine, check it, let it run for a while, keep checking it, and then you're also going to want to check it over the next couple of days to see if the levels dropped any, and the wheel is going to judder a little bit back and forth as air bubbles make their way through the system. Just keep your eye on it for a couple of days, and it will be no big deal. Next, we need to replace the tire we removed earlier. We're going to put the lug nuts on first while it's in the air. My assistant here is setting our torque wrench at 100 foot-pounds, but obviously we are going to torque the wheel when it is down on the ground. So I'm just snugging up the lug nuts in a star pattern, like you should always put on lug nuts on a wheel here. And then I'm going to switch the torque wrench and torque the wheels to 100 foot-pounds. And don't forget your plastic cover that hides the lug nuts. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, please visit twocarpros.com, where our online automotive experts are standing by ready to help for free 24/7. Thanks again, and we'll catch you next time.